Today we're looking at one of the craziest games I've seen in a long time, played between the 13-year-old record-setting youngest 2600 FIDE rated player in history, Yaz Erdogmuş of Turkey, and the legendary former world chess champion himself, Vladimir Kramnik. So it's the old guard versus the new generation, with one player on the decline and one on the rise, but this game is no walk in the park for anybody. As it rapidly descends into utter chaos, you're going to see drama and fireworks on the board, sacrifices will be offered, some will be accepted, some declined, but at the end of the day, it's all about whose king is safe and whose king is getting chased all over the board that finally decides this game. So strap yourself in, this one's a wild ride. Vladimir Kramnik is playing white in this recent blitz encounter on chess.com, and he opens the game with knight to f3, known as the Zukertort opening, named after Johannes Zukertort, who somehow managed to get his name attached to the 10% of all master level games that begin with knight to f3. Yaz responds with the always fashionable d5, grabbing him some of that center. We have g3 from Kramnik, headed in the direction of a King's Indian attack, where white will often play d3 followed by e4, but here Yaz throws him a bit of a curveball with the move knight to d7, which is not a super popular way to develop the knight, as it blocks the light-squared bishop, but this move is not unheard of, and it does have some logic to it, threatening a quick e5 and supporting a possible c5. So Kramnik responds d4, preventing e5, which is probably best. Yaz plays knight to b6, in violation of the cardinal opening rule that says don't move your pieces twice in the opening. Of course, there is another rule that says all chess rules have exceptions, and this rule is no exception. So knight to b6 is just fine, unblocking the light-squared bishop and preventing white from playing his thematic c4 for the moment. So Kramnik says, okay, just to show you how much I don't even care about pushing my c-pawn, I'm just going to block it now with knight to c3. Which looks a bit odd and unnecessarily committal. Bishop to g2 looks much more natural, but after a little investigation, I did discover some lines where it behooves white to have that knight ready to support the move e4, which I'm not going to get into, but the engine does give knight to c3 its stamp of approval, if that means anything to you. Next is bishop to f5. I like it. Let's get that bishop on the outside before we shut down the diagonal with e6. Of course, there is a slight issue with knight to h4, now played by Kramnik, looking for that desirable knight for bishop trade, but Yaz has plenty of decent options. He could play bishop to d7, bishop to g4 is apparently fine, but the move he chooses, e6, just might be best, allowing Kramnik to now grab that bishop with knight takes f5 while damaging the black pawn structure after e takes f5 with these here doubled pawns. So if you're wondering why, in the name of all that is holy and structurally sound, would Yaz allow such a thing? Well, the answer is that black has greatly increased his central control, with the e4 square now on lockdown, and this could be a good outpost for his knight, since if black were to capture it, then his pawn structure would be healed with a gain of space. Kramnik continues queen to d3, a move which would be kind of weird and bad if it didn't come with an attack on the undefended f-pawn, which Yaz now has to take a move to defend. He plays g6. We now have bishop to g2, increasing pressure on the d5 pawn, so Yaz just solidifies it with c6, and after Kramnik castles, we reach an interesting moment where black is way behind in development. Yaz only has one piece that isn't sitting on its original square versus Kramnik's 4 pieces, and a safely castled king, so this is enough to get my alarm bells ringing, but black is actually just fine here, and a lot of it has to do with his super solid pawn structure, which white doesn't really have any good way to strike at to break the position open. And believe it or not, the engine is actually recommending that black move yet another pawn, giving h5 here, going for a possible h4. None of it looks right or natural to human eyes, hence the move knight to f6, now played by Yaz, to which white's best response, not played by Kramnik, just might be f3, looking to bust open the center with e4 before black has the chance to castle. It's not winning or anything, but the engine's recommending bishop to g7, e4, d takes e4, f takes e4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen takes e4, check, queen blocks, queens come off the board, when white is a bit better in the endgame with the 2 bishops. But in the game, Kramnik goes for bishop to g5, apparently feeling it necessary to eliminate the knight on f6, even without provocation, since after bishop to e7, he doesn't even bother to wait for the move h6, he just goes straight for bishop takes f6. And after the recapture, he continues b3, just restricting black's knight, preventing knight to c4, when it could reroute to d6 and then hop into e4. So keeping a black knight out of e4 is a major part of his agenda here, which is why he made the capture on f6. b3 also supports a future c4. Yaz now gets his monarch to safety, and from Kramnik, we have e3, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing to reroute his knight to e2 and then to f4. His c-pawn can then be pushed to c4 with a lot of pressure coming down on black's d-pawn. So a very clear way forward here for white, but what should black be doing? It's not so obvious. Now the engine is recommending knight to d7, bishop to e7, and then knight to f6, improving the knight's position and again eyeing that e4 square. But Yaz has a much more aggressive plan in mind. He's decided to go straight for the white king, beginning with h5. And after knight to e2, he pushes to h4, which isn't a bad plan. He wants to play king to g7, rook to h8, and then try to make some magic happen down the h-file. But after c4, king to g7, and knight to f4, Yaz gets a little overzealous now with the move rook to h8. Better was to play bishop to g5 and then just eliminate the knight on f4, since after Kramnik's c takes d5 and the pawn recaptures, white now has the opportunity to win black's d5 pawn with the move queen to b5, which Kramnik apparently totally missed, since it looks like a pretty clear-cut way to win a pawn, hitting d5 3 times. Now black can throw in a6, but after queen to a5, nothing's been solved, and the d-pawn is just going to drop off. So it's interesting that Kramnik didn't spot this in the game, where he instead played rook f to c1, giving Yaz another opportunity to do something about that knight on f4, which he now takes with bishop to g5, undoubtedly planning bishop takes knight next. Now an interesting alternative would have been to play g5 instead, just kicking the knight away, while putting another pawn one step closer to the white king. Now this would remove defense from f5, but the engine is giving queen to d7 as a fine defense after playing h3, so that may have been just a tad stronger, but it didn't really matter since Kramnik now does not leave his knight on f4 as he should, but instead goes for knight to h3, hitting the bishop, which isn't necessarily a mistake, but after bishop to e7, that knight's not going to have a whole lot to do on h3 besides just going back to f4, when Yaz can just put his bishop back on g5 and then take the knight out. So this is kind of a pointless maneuver, but Kramnik now continues a4, threatening a5, which would kick the knight from b6, followed by queen to b5, attacking both d5 and b7. So Yaz responds a6 to keep the queen out of that square. Kramnik now puts his knight back on f4, but in case anyone is wondering about the following variation, a5, knight to d7, and bishop takes d5, let it be known that this does not simply win a pawn for white due to the little problem of h takes g3, uncovering an attack on the h3 knight. So that's no good for white, but in the game, after Kramnik's knight returns to f4, Yaz responds by putting his bishop right back on g5, once again preparing to capture the knight and alleviate some of that pressure on his d5 pawn. Now bishop to d6 may have been a bit stronger since it would have prevented the immediate rook to c5, now played by Kramnik, increasing the pressure on d5, ready to double the rooks on the c-file, at which point bishop takes knight on f4 is probably black's best move, but Yaz instead decides he's going to force that rook out of c5 with bishop to e7. Only trouble is, this does not force the rook out of c5, as Kramnik now finds the strongest move in the position. Pause the video if you think you can spot it too. White's best move is b4, offering Yaz the exchange, which he wisely declines, for if bishop takes c5, then there's b takes c5, attacking the knight on b6, and once it moves, then the d-pawn falls, leaving black with only one extra pawn worth of material, which is not worth the horrible position he now has with his terribly weak b-pawn and white's overwhelming central pawn presence, including a passed pawn. So Yaz, seeing that this would end very badly, After Kramnik's b4, decides to go for something equally losing, although from a practical perspective I can understand why he did it. He plays knight to d7, just offering Kramnik the d-pawn for free. Now the engine's saying to just leave the knight on b6 until white actually kicks it away with the move a5, and it prefers rook to c8 instead, although that's probably losing as well. But Yaz has decided that his best chance is to go all in on a kingside attack, so he's positioning his pieces for that as quickly as possible. Kramnik now does grab the free pawn on d5. We have h takes g3, opening the h-file, and after h takes g3, bishop to d6, taking aim at g3. Kramnik plays a5. A very strong move, putting that a pawn just one step closer to its promotion square, which could become very significant if white ends up winning the pawn on b7. Yaz continues queen to g5. Still no capture of the rook on c5, which both players realize is still totally losing for black, for the same aforementioned reasons. Knight to f4 is next. Kramnik doesn't want to worry about any bishop sacrifice on g3 to complicate matters. Very understandable. He's trying to keep things simple. But since bishop takes g3 wasn't a sound sacrifice anyway, it would have been a bit stronger to just double his rooks, leaving the knight on d5. That way, after the move Yaz plays next, knight to f6, white would be able to play knight takes f6, thus preventing knight to g4, which, as you're going to see, turns out to be more dangerous than a bishop sack on g3. But at this point, white is still winning, but just barely. What Kramnik needs to play now is bishop takes b7, while he has the chance. But he goes for rook a to c1, which looks very natural, since it's still no good for black to take on c5, but now black can nearly equalize with a very advanced move, which Yaz did not find. But pause the video if you'd like to take a crack at it, and let me know in the comments if you spot it, because it's far from obvious to me that in this position, black's only good move is rook a to e8, eyeing the e3 square. Now if white tries bishop takes b7, then knight to g4 comes with the idea of sacking the knight on e3, which because of the rook's position on e1, white would have to recapture with the pawn, after which queen takes g3 check starts running white into big trouble. And there is a lot more we could look at, but I want to get back to the game, to the position after Kramnik's rook a to c1, which I gotta say is one of the most complicated I've analyzed in a long time. If you fire up the engine here and just start playing around with some moves, you're gonna see some crazy stuff, which I'd love to get into, but we need to press on. Yaz does not find the best move here, rook a to e1, and instead plays knight to g4, to which Kramnik should respond rook to c7, which, no surprise, he didn't play. Although it does blow my mind just how accurately this game has been played so far. I mean, especially considering that it's blitz and they only have a handful of seconds per move on average, it really is nuts. But anyway, rook to c7 is white's only clearly winning move, attacking the b7 pawn with the rook, since you want the bishop to hang back on g2 and help shield the king. Knight to e6 check is also threatened here, which would win the black queen due to the pin on the f-pawn. There's also the potential for queen to b3 going after f7. Now if bishop takes c7 and rook takes c7, then black has lost some of his firepower, the white king is relatively safe, the b7 pawn is going to fall, and then probably the a6 pawn too, and black is totally lost. But Kramnik misses this final chance to retain a winning advantage. And in the game, after knight to g4, he plays the very unfortunate knight to h3, which looks reasonable on the surface. He wants to kick the black queen off of her dangerous post opposite his king, but this is a blunder, which Yaz now finds the correct and only way to punish. What would you play as black here? Take a quick gander if you'd like to try to spot black's winning tactic, now played by Yaz, which is rook takes h3, a beautiful exchange sacrifice which only works because of an even more stunning follow-up available to black after bishop takes h3, played by Kramnik, which is another sacrifice, knight takes f2, forking queen and bishop. So the only decent try for white is king takes f2. It's what Kramnik played, but here we go now with queen takes g3 check. And after king to e2, the queen takes the bishop on h3, The white king's defenses have been utterly annihilated. Black's now threatening queen to g2 check, followed by rook to h8, getting the rook into the action. So as my favorite rounder once said, it's highway time. That king needs to run. Kramnik plays king to d2. We have rook to e8 from Yaz with some pressure on e3. Kramnik takes the opportunity to get his rook to safety with rook 5 to c4. If nothing else, at least he's still got the exchange, but it's not going to save him. Yaz continues f4, hitting e3 a third time. So Kramnik pushes the pawn to e4, dreaming of a queen trade, which of course he's not going to get just yet. We have queen to g2 check, which will win white's e-pawn, however Kramnik responds. He decides to block with queen to e2, Yaz takes on e4, the queens come off the board, and after rook takes e4, Yaz has now 2 pawns for the exchange, so the material has equalized, but positionally white is completely finished. Black's 3 connected passers on the king side are just going to be way too much to deal with. Kramnik continues d5, not really sure why, because this just loses another pawn to bishop takes b4 check, and after king to d3, rook to e3 check, king to c2, and bishop to d6, it's pretty much resignation time. But Kramnik plays on for a few more moves. He tries rook to b1, going after b7, but after f3, king to d2 attacking the rook, rook to e5 attacking the pawn, rook to d4 defending, f2, rook to f1, bishop to c5 attacking the rook, rook to d3, and rook to e1. It's at this moment that Vladimir Kramnik loses the game on time. Probably by choice, seeing that he'll either have to give up his rook on f1 or allow Yaz to get a new queen. Since if rook takes e1, there's going to be bishop to b4 check. Anywhere the white king moves, black will capture the rook, queening the pawn. Of course, if rook to c3 blocking, then there's bishop takes c3 check. And if king takes c3, then again, black captures the rook, queening the pawn. So what a fantastically epic and complex struggle that was, and one of the most challenging for me to analyze, even with the help of the engine. Some of those middle game variations were just nuts. I'm sure I could have easily made this video 3 times as long, but if anyone wants to analyze this further on their own, I'll put the PGN in the comments, as well as the link to the game on chess.com. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Consider subscribing, leave a comment. All those things help the channel grow, and I will see you next time.